to give you a brief introduction to the main speakers of today, which are the real experts in this workshop. So I'm going to share the few slides that I have just to explain you how come we thought about organizing this workshop and why did we think it's useful. So give me a second, and here we are. Do you see my screen? I hope so. Yes? Yes. Okay, so you'll see that we were reflecting on this issue that I think it came about in all the talks that we have these 2 days, and especially in the keynotes that we attended. This idea that we have, as researchers, we have more and more data available. We have data available from national examinations, such as the ones that INVALSI does, but not only, but also from international studies, many of which are collected by the OECD or the IEA. And we are striving to, of course, improve education, to add school improvement, to introduce innovation in schools. And for that, we acknowledge more and more that we need a collaboration between different actors, different stakeholders. And of course, part of this are the researchers that can interpret this data and that are trying to convey the messages that they found in that research. But a big important in this process are also other stakeholders, such as the teachers, such as policymakers, and so on. And more we have a discussion on how we can increase make the communication between these different actors better, so we can actually use properly the data that we have, data that is not perfect, but data that can help us answer many questions of policy interest, but also of educational practices. So I think, especially in the last keynote of today, we were talking a lot about the need for some basic data literacy for teachers and for policymakers. And that's one part of the conversation, but we have the other part of the conversation. We have the people, the researchers that are working with this data, the people that are knowledgeable about this data, that mostly at this moment in time, they transmit their findings in empirical articles, which are very informative, but perhaps the audience that they have, it's limited. So there are many initiatives, more and more, that are being taken by many organizations to try to convey messages that are important for policy, for practice, in a concise way, yet very correct and based on empirical findings way. And one of these ways are the policy briefs. You have examples of these initiatives from the IEA, from the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, and we will talk a lot about this today, and I will tell you more in a bit, but also from the OECD. As Francesco was saying, examples such as PISA in Focus, Teaching in Focus series, and so on. I'm sure he can help with our conversation. So our initial idea, hoping that we will be in Rome, was a little bit different than what we will do today, in a sense that our initial intention was actually to have some people that are really working hands-on with the data. That proved to be a little bit more difficult. So, but we're really hoping in another edition we will get to do that. But nonetheless, what we're doing today, it's meant to be an introduction from what we know, and you will see that we are having some experts that have quite some experience in the topics. And just to give you an overview of what policy briefs are and what could be the features, successful features of these policy briefs, and how they cannot be boring but useful for different stakeholders. And then we have 2 practical examples of 2 briefs from the IEA Compass Briefs in Education series. So to explain you exactly what is going to happen, first we have the first session, and for this session we invited David Rutkowski. David, it's an associate professor at Indiana University, and I think he has a perfect background for what we're doing today, because he's an expert on educational policy, but also an expert on measurement, and he's working a lot with large-scale assessment, but also with translating findings from large-scale assessment into educational policies. He's been collaborating with many international organizations, including the IEA, the OECD, and not only, and had projects in many, many countries. And also he is actively involved in being the editor of the IEA Compass Briefs in Education series. So he will give you an overview on policy briefs. Then our second presentation will be an example of a policy brief. It's an example that will be presented by Ellen Claes. Ellen is associate professor at KU Leuven, and she's education studies. So in all her work, she's trying to stay in touch with the messages received from policymakers and looking at the priorities at the European level in fields like citizenship education, but also trying to ensure a translation of these findings for teachers. So the brief that she will present today will deal with the problematic that it's actually shaping educational policy in the area of citizenship education for many, many years. And then in the other example is going to be presented by Andrés Sandoval Hernandez. He is a lecturer at the University of Bath. And he has also a lot of experience in large-scale assessment, but also working for policy and informing educational policy. He also works with a lot of international organizations such as the IEA, such as UNESCO, and I'm sure that if you had the opportunity to watch his keynote in the first day of the conference, you know a lot about it. And he is going to present another example, an example that is embedded in the Latin American country context with problematics that were perceived as being important there. And he collaborated in this with the different stakeholders from different countries, including, I think, from colleagues from the equivalent of INVALSI in Mexico that at that time was INEA. And what we aim with this is to have an interactive discussion with you. Our colleague Linda Stiles, that was to organize it, unfortunately cannot be with us today, but I am going to take care of the discussion. So please, if you have questions, address them in chat or tell me that you would like to address a question. I will be attentive to that. And again, as I said, if you feel like addressing that question in Italian, we will do our best to translate it for you. Of course, we prefer English, but we will try. And yeah, feel free to have questions and also input. This is meant to be an interactive session. So with this being said, I'm going to stop my sharing and I'm inviting David to start his introduction. Thank you all.
All right, everyone. You can hear me okay? Okay, great. And hopefully you are looking at my slide and not something else.
Yes,
my name's David. You are good. My name is David Rutkowski, as Magda said, and I want to thank Magda and the INVALSI team for inviting me to talk at this workshop. I really enjoy this idea of policy briefs, and I really think they're exciting. And I'm happy to share this experience with you and talk about briefs. So what are policy briefs? And that's normally, if we were all sitting in a room, we'd have this discussion of what you think policy briefs are. And one of the things that I'm going to just tell you is it's kind of a trick question. And the reason it's a trick question is because policy briefs take so many different forms. And that's something that we're going to talk about today. What you're going to see if you went onto Google and you Googled policy brief in education, you're going to find very short one-page documents or really long documents, and they almost become like white papers or policy memos, some kind of briefing reports. The problem is there's no single definition of what a policy brief is. So what I did, as a good academic would, I went to a bunch of different policy textbooks, in different policy textbooks with policy analysis, or in textbook on what policy is. And I looked up at how they define briefs. So there are a bunch of definitions here. For example, policy briefs outline the rationale for choosing a particular policy alternative or course of action in a current policy debate. So here we see policy briefs as kind of giving a rationale to one of the alternatives, or giving a course of action. So it's an active document. Or a policy brief's documents are designed to support more informed evidence-based policy decision making. And here in the United States, we use this quite a lot, that organizations that have some kind of political leaning, they might design a policy brief to inform evidence-based policy making, but also to kind of influence decision-making based on some evidence that they collect. Another thing a policy brief could be is policy briefs are short documents that focus on a policy, right? So that's different from the other two, which are active and persuasive in one sense, but this is kind of a brief about what a policy is, or a brief about a certain policy. And we could see that for a lot of different reasons, right? Maybe a organization or a government implemented some policy in a country and they wanted to promote that policy within their country and also around the world. That happens a lot. Another definition of a policy brief is policy briefs are documents that convince a target audience on the urgency of the current problem and the need to adopt some kind of solution. So here a policy brief is a document that says that there's a problem. This problem needs to be solved, and we have a solution for that problem. And so that's how the policy brief is kind of situating a circumstance, defining a problem, and providing a solution to that problem. And there's more. Policy briefs are short, neutral summaries that explain a topic important to policymakers. So this would be that this topic exists, and we're neutral on it. We're not trying to persuade a policymaker to do one thing or another thing. What we're trying to do is to tell a policymaker that this problem exists. And here we would see something in maybe some of the briefs that we're going to look at later today would fall into this category, that we know that there's a gender gap. In the policy brief is just looking at that as kind of a gender gap. This gender gap exists, but you're not giving them a solution on how to solve the problem of the gender gap. You're just giving them kind of this neutral summary that is gender gap exists. Or policy briefs develop information and analysis followed by recommendations on a policy-oriented topic. They're found useful by policymakers, policy specialists, media, and interested scholars. And we're going to talk about a little bit further who actually uses these policy briefs. And sometimes we run into a problem by just using the term policy brief, that we just think policy briefs are used by policymakers. In education, one of the issues is that who is a policymaker in education, right? Is a policymaker just at the national level? Are they at the international level? I know Francisco's here. Are policymakers at the OECD level? Even though they don't create policy per se, they definitely influence policy in certain ways. So are people at the OECD policymakers? Are teachers policymakers? Certainly they influence policy in the classroom. Superintendents, principals. So who are the policy actors? And the reason that's going to become important is who are we going to be writing to, right? If we looked at any of these definitions on what we want a brief to be, who are we writing to and who are we writing towards becomes really important. So what should we do, right? Because there are no central guidelines or standards to briefs. When I work with students on program evaluations, for example, one of the things that is so easy when we do program evaluations, when I work with countries or again, students going out to do a program evaluation, is we have a set of standards. In the United States, these are specific standards, but we have standards that we can use to guide us through. When we're writing an academic paper, we have standards. We can use a manual, right? This is how this is set up. We don't have those standards for policy briefs, and policy briefs make so many different forms. And that's why sometimes it becomes really confusing on what to do or how we're going to write these briefs, right? So the first thing we have to think about when we're writing policy briefs is how do we define the brief? What is the purpose of the brief? And what are we doing this brief for? So for this conversation, we'll say what David says that policy briefs are. And what I think they are for now is succinct presentations of a problem, context, findings, and some kind of recommended actions. Now, we don't necessarily have to be strong in our recommendations, but we have to give people, I believe we have to give people something. Some implications of why this is important, even though it's not a straight recommendation. But there has to be some honesty that we're writing this brief for a purpose, and that here are the reasons that we're doing it. And we're going to tell the people that we're, when we write the briefs, that purpose exists. I would suggest 2 to 8 pages long, easy to understand for an intended audience, no need for additional readings. Oh, shoot, sorry. Short, about 1,800 words minus tables. And the ultimate goal is to promote some kind of change by informing policy, right? We're writing this to promote some kind of change, even if it's about the policy, even if it's about that something exists, right? The gender gap is something that we need to be concerned about. These are action documents that we're writing to promote some kind of change, which may be different from some of the academic work we do, right? We don't necessarily always want to promote change in the academic work we do. We might just want to inform ideas, but it's this idea of being active within our policy briefs to promote some kind of change. Policy briefs should also be a synthesis of findings, especially if we're doing empirical briefs, which we're going to talk about in this workshop, a synthesis of findings so that it can be used by the policy community. Notice not only the traditional idea of policymakers, and I talked about that a little bit before, but in education, the unique thing is that there are so many people that influence the way policy is done or policy is implemented. In the United States, for example, we have local school boards, which really create much of the policy for what we do in our schools in the United States, right? So instead of the federal level, it's really a localized system where the federal government has fairly little say in how the educational system works, right? Where in somewhere like Norway, which has more of a federal, or the federal government has much of a say with how the education works. So we really need to think about how are we opening up and who are we talking to. In defining these groups is going to be imperative. It's who our audience is, right? Who exactly are we talking to? Because what we find when we do research in the policy literature, what we find is if we don't have a very good audience, it speaks to nobody, right? And the other thing that we're going to talk about here is we want to translate research in a way that can communicate your results to your audience, right? So everyone in INVALSI is doing some kind of research in a sense of collecting data, or you have all this data. But you want to communicate it to a specific audience. And for a policy brief, we're doing it to an audience that has some kind of influence in policy. So why briefs, right? Why don't we just write long reports. The first thing is policymakers and their staffs rarely read research articles. In the United States, I bet if we went to our Congress or our House, there's going to be very, very few times that any kind of leadership is going to read a research article. They might be given a research article with a synopsis of that, but they're not reading it. They're busy, right? That's one of the reasons. And honestly, we as academics, we're taught to be really bad writers, right? Research articles are normally really boring. And we write in a way that's not engaging or not purposeful for the policy community. And research suggests that policymakers, at least in North America and Europe, use information that they can easily digest, right? So they're making decisions, and they usually make decisions really quickly on digestible things. And this is where the OECD, I think, does a really nice job of giving policymakers information that they can easily digest in 1 to 2 page infographics, for example, that these things could go out to the policy community and really make an impact. Of course, in those situations, the policymaker has to be data savvy in a sense that they can understand graphs, which is something that's not always the case, right? We have a huge amount of people that are policymakers in the United States, both in education and outside of education, that wouldn't understand basic regression analysis or a correlation. So some of the graphs that we are going to give them isn't really going to work. And that's going to make a difference on, again, defining your audience becomes so important. Other reason why briefs. Briefs can allow organizations to highlight some of its amazing work in a forum that is a non-academic audience may read, right? And so if your organization has a lot of work that they're doing, briefs give the organization that opportunity to kind of show off, to show that it's important. And briefs also allow leaders in the field to present important aspects or parts of their work. And here I have the IEA here, because this is some of the examples that we're going to use. But we could put OECD data, we could put INVALSI data, but it's important to that community, right? So you're going to be able to present work that has important aspects into the parts to the community that you want to talk to. And you're allowed to write policy briefs in ways that can communicate to that community, which is kind of exciting. It can be really fun. So who writes them? Academics, government officials, private consultants, here IEA researchers, NGO and other IGO staff. Lots of cool people, and even, again, some attending this meeting that we're talking about today. A lot of different people write these briefs, and it's important to get these different voices into the voice of the policymakers. So where do we start? And that's one of the things that maybe some of our presenters today can talk about. But one of the first things we have to do is define a topic, and we have to define our audience. Those, I think, are the two most important things when I work with people to think about. Who are the audience and what is the topic? Sorry. So choosing a topic. Does your research or the thing that you what you're working on need to be translated so someone can understand it? Is there a need? And I think that's a really important part of if you should be writing this, or how to choose your topic. Is there important information from one of your studies that should be made accessible? You know, I do some measurement research. Some of that stuff does not need to be made accessible to policymakers, right? They don't care, nor should they really care, right? They have more interesting things to do with their time than to worry about if it should be a 2PL or 3PL model given the population, right? That's not really that important for them, or even if there's a little diff in a model. So that information doesn't need to be necessarily accessible. But there is so much research that many of you do that does need to be accessible. Andreas is going to talk about some of the brief, or one of the briefs that he did. And I think some of the information in that brief was so important and needs to be understood by a broader community. And I know he's done follow-up work on this. Do you want to need to advocate for a position? And I think that's something that we all need to think about, right? Do we want to advocate for a position in our brief? And again, when Andreas talks maybe about his brief, I think there is some advocacy for a position, right? That there needs, you're asking for some change and you're kind of, you want people's position to be different. Alignment. Does your topic align with governmental priorities? And I think this is one of the really important things. Now, maybe if you're one of the big international organizations, you can try to sway people into a priority, right? But for most of us, we need to think about, does the government care about this, right? And is it going to fit into an agenda that you're going to move forward? In the United States, for example, if you were going to write and students write different briefs. I live in a very conservative state, and the government is really, really pro charter schools and pro privatization of education. Now, if you came in and only talked about promoting public education, the policymakers aren't going to listen to you, right? So you need to work somehow to align with their priorities to kind of push your agenda. And so that's something to keep in mind. Is your topic strong enough to change those priorities, right? And so how are you going to change priorities within the government if that's something that you want to do? And is there a current public movement? And one of the great times to write a brief is when there's a current public movement that you can use that in a sense to kind of push your agenda. And I think that's something really important for you guys to make sure that you align topics as you're thinking about writing briefs to these kind of agendas. So choosing your topic. First of all, it needs to be interesting. That's a given, right? So it needs to be interesting. It needs to be informative, right? You need to be able to give them something, right? The policy community, whoever you decide. It needs to be current, and you need to be excited. One of the things that I see the most when I work with authors is they're not excited about the brief comes out flat, right? And I think anybody that's worked on anything, when you're not excited about it, it's going to come out flat. And a thing, when we go to the end of the slides, you're going to see the process that we use when I edit a brief. And anyone that's worked on a brief that I know, these briefs take a long time. They might be just a few pages, but sometimes it's easier to write the academic article than it is to actually engage with the brief or to write the brief, because they're quite a lot of work. So you need to be excited about it. Really quickly on identifying stakeholders. I use this name stakeholders, and those are who have a vested interest in the policy issue and are in a position to use or the evaluation results, the results in some way. So they're able to use the research results in a way to enact some kind of change. And as I talked about before, there's a lot of people that enact change in education. And you have to think about the circumstance that you're working in of why you might want those people to enact change. I like to separate stakeholders in the primary stakeholder, secondary stakeholder, and tertiary stakeholder. And if you think about your primary stakeholder, this is exactly the audience who you want to be talking to, right? So I would challenge everybody that wants to write a brief to write this down. These are the people that I'm talking to, right? And you jot them down. And that's going to then influence your tone, the kind of information that you can include in your topic, in a sense. The secondary stakeholders these are people that may use the information, right? They're not necessarily the most important people that you're writing to, but they're people that can use the information for some kind of enacting change. And your tertiary stakeholders are people that just might be interested in the topic. And when you go in and you write this down, the reason it's important is because it helps you for a number of reasons. First, you know who you're writing to, You want to make sure you're not just writing to your tertiary stakeholders, but you're writing to your primary stakeholders. That's really important. The second is when you go to advertise these things, when you go to give them out, you have a list of certain groups that you're working with, right? And that's really important as you go in writing. So there's a couple reasons to define your stakeholders. In the end, you want to play to your audience, right? I like to go see live music, and there's nothing more embarrassing, right? Even as an audience member, when you're in the audience and nobody else is, right? And you want to make sure when you're writing to your brief, because they need so much, it's so much work to write these things that you are giving it to the people and you're writing to the people that want to read this. So you need to question yourself. Who will use the information? Would an answer to the question reduce the present uncertainty? Would the answer to the question yield important information? Would it have an impact on the course of the events? These are all really important questions that you need to ask yourself as you move forward. Is the question merely a passing interest to someone, or does it focus on a critical dimension? And do you have time, resources to do the work? And what I mean about a passing interest is a lot of times that we get interested in something, but we know it's not going to last very long, right? A policy brief is going to take you a little bit of time to write. You're not going to write one in a week and get it published. So you want to make sure that the work you're going to put into this is actually going to be helpful and at least be there for a little bit of a while. So then if all of this is what you want to do, then you have the green light. So you want to write this brief. And we're going to talk, I don't have much time here, and I'm just going to show you like how a brief outline can look, but they can take many forms. First of all, you're going to have some kind of summary. You're going to need an introduction with a hook, right? And what I mean by the hook, this is the thing of interest. And maybe when Andreas or Ellen are talking about their briefs, they could talk about like the hook, what was really important for them. The results, you can mention data analysis, but data analysis really isn't all that important to explain how you analyzed your data in your brief. Again, policymakers really don't care about how you actually did your analysis. That's a good place for the appendix. Findings and discussion in your policy implications or recommendations, they're really important. And the other thing I really have found throughout time is that future readings are helpful, because when policymakers become interested, or people that can influence policy become interested, they need more than your brief, right? Your brief is only a starting point. So giving them then the further information for their staff or people that they work with becomes really important. So that's why we have future readings. This is one of my last slides, and I just wanted to give you a general publishing process that we go through at the IEA when we write briefs. So we come up with some kind of agreement with an author. The author comes up with a draft. Then it comes to me, and we sometimes go back once or twice on revisions, sometimes more. And then it goes through an external review process. Normally, I have 1 to 2 reviewers, but the truth is it goes for about 5 or 6 reviewers. We have an editor, which is me. I summarize. I go back to the author. Then we go through drafts if we have to do more revisions. Then it's copy editing, author approval, publishing. So if you look at this process, it's a long process, right? And for briefs to be done well, I found that if you're going to work with academics, these are kind of the processes that we have to go through, because writing a brief is really a different type of writing, and it's not writing that we're normally used to. And maybe some of the people that are the authors of the briefs that they could talk about how they had to change some of their writing, because we have 2 academics talking today about their briefs. I have some ideas about the IEA Compass briefs. Please check them out if you just put IEA Compass brief. Here's my information. I'll share these slides, and I wanted to put this slide on there so you have my information. Send me comments, questions, ideas. But I'm really looking forward to seeing the next couple presentations on the briefs that have been written. And I'm excited to see what the authors have to say and how they thought the process went. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. If any of you would like to have some questions now, you may. Please let us know in the chat. You will also have this opportunity at the end, so it's really up to you. Otherwise, we continue with Ellen. And I think we can.
Okay, do you see my slides already?
Yes, not full screen yet.
No, I have to put it on slideshow and then I can start. I will also put on my camera.
Yes.
It's maybe useful too.
Yes, now we're.
then you can see my face. Okay, I will also put on my alarm clock because as most academics, I tend to like to talk a lot. So I will make sure that I'm brief presenting this brief.
No, one thing, it is fine if we take a couple of minutes more. We made sure that we have at least one more half an hour to go at the end of the session if there's discussion. So don't worry too much if you're 2-3 minutes over.
Yeah, but I will anyhow. I will put the alarm clock. Okay, here I go. Good afternoon and thank you, INVALSI, for inviting me, and thank you, David, for that good introduction. Because indeed, when you presented the whole process, I could recognize the process I went through. Also, as a teacher educator, next to being an associated professor in political science, focusing at civic education mostly, I'm also responsible for the teacher training program, and I started there in 2013. And I noticed in the beginning, at the start of my career, that it was not always easy to talk to teachers without me feeling uncomfortable in being over nuanced and not following the exact results that my multi-level models showed me. And I remember that when I tried to explain things about things to them about stimulating the civic knowledge of their students, for example, I was like over nuancing myself. In the end, I think that the teachers for which I was making and doing the presentations, well, they did not really have a clue on how to work with these results in their classrooms. And of course, this is one of the things we would like teachers to do, and we would also like policy to do, actually to recognize the research that we do and to indeed work with it in a very practical way. And then I started to look at myself and the way I was presenting my data and presenting my work. And now in talking to teachers or talking to policymakers, I really want to start from the excitement that we both feel as researchers for a certain topic. And all researchers have that. They're very interested in the topic and they want to talk about that. And the better and the best way to talk about it is to start by something that other people can relate to. And often these things other people can relate to are things that actually happened, for example, in a classroom. And that's a bit how Magda, I think, and I also approached this policy brief, starting with things that happened in Europe around that time, and actually talking to people, about things that were that came very close to them. For example, we started this policy brief on tolerance towards immigrants with the links to the terrorist attacks Europe has known in the last years. So really getting close to people's lives and really telling a story is something that I find the most interesting in writing that brief. I already mentioned that I did not write this brief alone. I wrote it together with the host of this session, with Magda. And she was responsible also for the data analysis and the beautiful graphs you will see, and when I talk more about the results. Now, the brief looks a bit like this. So we actually started, I already said, from the terrorist attacks, and also the tension that sometimes the rise of the migrant population in before more homogeneous societies puts and the strain it can put on society. That was the start of our brief, but we also wanted to, looking at the way to work on tolerance towards each other, also wanted to come up with a kind of solution, and therefore we really thought that looking into the correlates of tolerance towards immigrants would be useful to inform policy. And especially when you think about the background of actually stimulating tolerant competences in young people, this will become very relevant, because the background, of course, is that the European Commission and the European Council, both of them, put extra emphasis on civic education in the last the last decade. And that's an important background when looking especially at political attitudes like political tolerance. That's the way I'm going to build my brief. I'm first of all going to talk about the background and actually the reason why we think this correlate between civic education, civic knowledge and political tolerance, or as we call it in brief, tolerance towards immigrants, is so interesting. And then I'm going to give you a small insight in the ICCS data we use to write this policy brief, because that's something important I also want to mention. We did not do very fancy statistics, but before we could do these more simple presentations of the data, we actually made sure that we were sure about the fact that, for example, the items and the scales we used were cross-culturally equivalent. So a lot of work gets into the data preparation phase, actually, and you want to make sure that you can do this and that you can present data in a more simple way for a broader audience. So a lot of work still is done before you can write a policy brief. And then I'm going to look at the results with you and really the link between tolerance and civic knowledge. And then, of course, the implication for policy and practice, because that's also always, I think, a part of a policy brief. What do we think readers have to remember when they read our work? Now, for the background, I already mentioned the background for this brief was the heightened sensitivity in the European Union for civic education. And this civic education is not always in all countries of the European Union seen as very important, and it often also goes together with maybe how conservative a government is. But the European Union really decided, look, civic education is very important, and it's also important for the development of civic competences in youth, and especially thinking about and linking it to tolerance towards immigrants in Europe. You can see that even in the definitions of civic education, the European Union, so very important policy institutions identify this harmonious, coexistent and mutual beneficial development of individuals individuals, or the value of diversity. So there was actually really a framework of thinking that this writing about the correlates with tolerance towards immigrants was something that would interest a broader policy audience. Now, why was the link in our point of view with civic knowledge so important? Because of course, stimulating attitudes is something that's, and especially attitudes in adolescence, is something that is not done easily. And we know that civic knowledge is something that we can stimulate actually through schools and through schooling. So this was something very, very important to focus at. And we also know that in Europe also, European societies have become more and more diverse. In that, Europe is no exception. And I'm looking at my other colleagues. I also think in the US, but also in Latin America, that diversity actually increased a lot in the last decades. And there's also the recent tension and the concern of this influx of migrants. And linked to more the academic literature, we always talk about the strain maybe on the social capital of a society and on the social cohesion in Europe. So why this link is important? One, because with stimulating civic knowledge, we know that we can do that through schooling. And of course, why is tolerance important? Yeah, why we see that the more and more diverse society gets, the more strain there can be on the social cohesion of that society. Now, for the data that we used for our policy brief, we decided to use the International Civic and Citizenship Education data of 2016. Why? Because we know that this data especially looks into the civic knowledge of 14-year-olds, kids in their young adolescence. And we also know that they do it in a way that is comparable over countries. So that's really interesting to work with. And also not only to give like kind of the mean score for the European student population of the 14-year-olds, but also to look into the possible differences there are between countries in civic knowledge levels. And that always brings me to the fact that, yeah, often only policymakers look at PISA rankings. But of course, there's much more to tell. And that's also a way, with this policy brief, we also tried to actually make policymakers look beyond merely the ranking and having very good comparable data cross-country is needed to do that and to make these analyses. Now, as you see, to look into the civic knowledge and the civic attitudes of students, the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study in 2016, of which I think INVALSI also did the data collection, used a lot of instruments. And for this policy brief, we will especially use the cognitive testing that was done by the IEA. And the results of the students on these cognitive tests, but we will also use the question about tolerance towards immigrants in Europe from the regional student questionnaire. So you see here that there were a lot of instruments used, and these instruments all have their specific focus. In the international student questionnaire, for example, we also could take into account the background characteristics of the students, and there also linking to tolerance and to civic knowledge are some things that you actually can talk to policymakers about how to design civic education, for example. So this was our data set, and the most important part, the two latent constructs that we used, civic knowledge and tolerance towards immigrants, came from the International Cognitive Test and the Regional Student Questionnaire. For the tolerance towards immigrants, to be more specific, we also presented the actual questions in the brief, because we think that teachers and also policymakers get a clearer view of what we actually measured when we also present the questions. So for tolerance towards immigrants, these questions were used, these statements actually were used. And students could indicate if they strongly disagreed, agreed, or strongly agreed with the fact that immigrant children should have the same opportunities for education that other children in the country have, or that immigrants who live in the country for several years should have the opportunity to vote in elections, or that immigrants should have the opportunity to continue their own customs and lifestyles. And last but not least, that immigrants should have the same rights that everyone else in the country has. So you see very explicit statements, very accessible statements for 14-year-olds, and they had to express if they agreed or not, and how much they agreed with it. And then doing the analysis and presenting it in a way I think is very insightful, we came to this graph. And in this graph, we decided to include the 5th percentile and the 59th percentile of students' levels of tolerance towards immigrants. The dots are the mean scores of the country. And what is very interesting, I think, in our point of view, and we try to stress that in the text too, is that you see that the mean score, well, there isn't, the mean score is very clear, but that the mean score, of course, is not everything. For example, looking at Sweden, you see that they actually score in mean very high. They're really tolerant 14-year-olds, you would say. But then when you look at the spread between the 5th and the 59th percentile, well, there's a big spread between that. For example, when you look at Belgium, and the country I'm from, at the Flemish part, you see that, well, on average, students that responded to that question are less tolerant than the Swedes, but the spread also is not so big. So you can say that this information for a policymaker can be interesting. They can maybe in Sweden decide, okay, the 5th percentile, that's something we might consider or focus on that group when we design a policy, or when we look at the curriculum, looking into how to actually focus or stimulate that tolerance towards immigrants. Now for civic knowledge, I think the IEA and ICCS did something interesting, in the sense that they had a lot of questions asking students about what they knew about politics and social issues. But often these were hypothetical situations, and not all the students answered the same questions. So as a researcher, you also have to take into account appraisal values and things like that. But of course, these are very difficult things to explain to laymen. And that's why I think the classification that the IEA also has in its infographics into below level D and going up to level A is something that can be very insightful. We did not include this in the brief, but for example, to say what level A is, the IEA made this infographic, and a pupil at level A can, for example, justify the separation of powers. And that's something that somebody at level D cannot do. They can recognize that all people, for example, are equal before law. So I think making these classifications is something that can be very interesting for teachers and for policymakers. And that's why we use this classification in our further analysis. But I don't have a lot of minutes anymore. So I'm going over to how we try to represent the results. Here you see the average levels of tolerance towards immigrants across the civic knowledge proficiency level. And we really chose to put the level of knowledge, the civic knowledge, into two categories, the level A and above, and you saw what that meant in the previous graph, and the level C and below. And here you clearly see the distinction between the level C and below and the level A and above regarding tolerance. So you clearly see that what we expected, that the more knowledgeable students are, of course, the higher they score also on tolerance. And that is actually equal, and that's actually the same thing we see in every country. Of course, again, like the previous slides, we see the fluctuations between countries too. And we also see the distance between the red and the blue dot. And that distance is also important to know the difference between the civic knowledge levels. If they are small, for example, in Belgium, they're pretty small. And in Italy, I also thought that they were mediocre. In Sweden, for example, here again, there is a larger difference to be noted. Okay, then I also explained that linking to the student questionnaire, we also were able to control for several background characteristics. And that is something that we presented in our brief like this. And here you can say that actually our main point was that civic knowledge is really important when you maybe want to work on a more tolerant community. And why? Because civic knowledge and political tolerance or tolerance towards immigrants really goes together and is the most important identifier here. Next to, for example, let me look at Italy. I think the Italian and the Flemish results were similar here. And the second place, you have been a native born, then you're less tolerant towards immigrants, which is not surprising. And then the third important characteristics are being a boy, then you're also, you tend to be less tolerant. And so you see again, you see that there are similarities, but this graph also shows that specifically for one country that you can look at what characteristic now is on which place for your country. And you can indeed inform policy based on this graph. Now, what did we decide for policy and practice? Because Magda and I talked long and hard about this, because actually we are not the people that want to take a stance, and we want to be very nuanced, and we want to give a nuanced advice. And based on the analysis that we did, but of course on previous analysis we did, we came to the conclusion that in this brief, it was important that people remembered that you have to consider both average tolerance scores, but also their variability across countries, especially if you want to look at a civic education policy in a country, for example. Yeah, so it's important to know where you're at in a ranking, but it's also important to see how you differ from these other countries and to actually make some sensible, to draw some sensible conclusions out of analysis and large-scale assessment. Now, we also concluded that you have to strengthen the efforts to provide these learning opportunities, because indeed there is a strong correlate between civic knowledge and tolerance towards immigrants, and that actually fostering civic knowledge is something that schools can do. So you should invest in civic education, and you should, and then you can maybe also even invest in that more tolerant attitude of your students. And last but not least, Civic knowledge shows stronger association with tolerance compared with the several other background characteristics. And we saw the red dot there in the previous figure. That was actually on the first place of all the background characteristics we tested for. So this is the way we try to talk about the going together of civic knowledge and tolerance towards immigrants, and how we wanted to show people that it's not only about the mean score and where you're at in the rank, but also about sometimes the distances and the specificities in your country to actually inform policy well. And I think, okay, a bit over time, but not so much. So I want to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Do we have any immediate questions? I didn't see any in the chat, so I propose we move on to Andres, and if there's any, please write it in the chat and I'll pick it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. So let me share my screen. That's it. Great. Thank you very much. Well, I'm gonna talk to you about another example from a policy brief from this Compass, IEA Compass Briefs in Education series. And in this case, the brief, the question, the issue that is that we're focusing on is about Latin America, is in the Latin American context. So let me start. The name of the brief is a question, is democracy overrated? Latin American students' support for dictatorships. And let me tell you a little bit about the background of this brief. We are using also data from ICCS. This is study on civic and citizenship education from 2016. Well, that was when they collected the data, but it was published a year later. And when it was published, and when the report was published, as you may know, this study has a regional components. So there is the international version of the data set of the questionnaires, and there are some questions that are particular for different regions of the world. We have a European component, a Latin American one, and an Asian one. The Latin American one included some questions about democracies and dictatorships. And the reason is because different regions of the world, the countries belong to the different regions, they agree on what are the topics that are more important for them, or things that they want to get more information on. So one of those questions was, well, they were actually two questions, very specific ones. And they were, would you support a dictatorship if it brings economic development? And the other one was, would you support a dictatorship if it brings security and order? For these two questions, over 70% of the students, we are talking about 13, 14-year-old students, 70%, 70, they said, yes, I would support a dictatorship. And of course, that made it to the headlines of the main newspapers in the region, because everybody was even scared, no? Latin America, as you may know, have a history of dictatorships not long ago, and it was a disaster. And even then, it was, so this is why it was very surprising that the majority of these students were saying, yes, I would support a dictatorship. I was saying this was in 2016, so 5 years ago. That means that these 70% of the children are now voting. So we are going through very important democratic processes now, elections. And we have that most of these children, well, adults, young adults now, are willing to support a dictatorship. So that was quite a big thing. So we became interested in this issue, and we wanted to know more about it. So I got together with colleagues, Daniel Miranda, from the Universidad Católica de Chile, Ernesto Treviño, Silvia Schmelkes, Daniela and Ernesto are from Chile, Silvia Schmelkes is from Mexico, and myself. So we got interested and we decided to find out more. We wanted to know what's going on. What we wanted to know is we wanted to identify school, family, and system characteristics that could explain these patterns. Because what we could read in the newspapers at the time was things like the education system is failing society. Education system is failing, is not providing a good education to our children. And the proof to say that was that they are willing to support the dictatorship. So we were really wondering, can we blame it completely on the education system? Are there any other factors that can help to explain these patterns? So we wanted to, that was the idea that we have. To what extent is it schools? Or if we talk about schools, what part of schools? What part of the education? What can education do about this? What can families do about this? And what can political systems do about this? It's worrying in any case. So we wanted to know more. And of course, we wanted to identify practice and policy implications. As David was saying in his introduction, we are not telling countries specifically what to do, but we do have a position here. And the position is you cannot blame it all on schools. You cannot blame it all on teachers and education system. It's a more complex problem that we can address from different points. So that was our position on this issue. So the analysis that we did had to do with that. No, the first thing we wanted to see, okay, schools. What part of schools? What can schools do about it? What we did, as Ellen was saying, we all know that civic knowledge is the thing that the schools can affect the most. If anything schools can do, or we have evidence to say that they can change or influence, is the knowledge that the children receive. In this case, civic knowledge. So we wanted to know whether there is an association between civic knowledge and the support or the likelihood to support a dictatorship. And we found that yes, there is a negative association between civic knowledge and the support for dictatorships. This is for the question about economic benefits. Would you support a dictatorship if it brings economic benefits? And as you can see, we have one column for each country. On the right, we have the people who disagree, who would not support a dictatorship. And on the right, we have the people who agree, who say they would support a dictatorship. And the y-axis is the average achievement in civic knowledge. So as we can see in all cases, for all countries, the students who have higher civic knowledge, they would also, they are less likely to support a dictatorship. So that tells us something, no? Schools can do something. If we look at the other question, it's the same question. Would you support a dictatorship if it brings order and safety? The pattern is very, very similar. In all cases, the students who have higher educational achievement are the ones who are less likely to support a dictatorship. So we have part of the answer now. But we also wanted to know, as you may remember, what can families do? Can families do anything about it? Do families play a role? And what we did was to analyze the association between communication with parents about social and political issues and support for dictatorships. And there is also a negative association, which means the more the children, the more the young people talk to their parents about social and political issues, the less likely are they to support a dictatorship. Again, the patterns are very similar. This is for the support for a dictatorship if it brings economic benefits, and the frequency with which students talk to their parents about social and political issues. And as you can see, the less they talk to their parents, children talk to their parents, the more they are likely to support a dictatorship. And it's in Chile, Colombia, Dominican Republic, and Mexico, the difference is actually very big between the ones who never talk to their parents and the ones who talk every day to their parents. So we can also see that there is an important role that potentially families could play in addressing this issue. When we look at the graph that is related with order and safety, it's very similar. The pattern is very similar. Again, Chile, Colombia, Dominican Republic, and Mexico, we have very clear differences, significant in all cases. When we look at Peru, in the previous and this question, there is the differences are less pronounced. However, if you compare never with daily, still the difference is quite big. Yeah. So the third thing I wanted to check is systems. What can systems do? In this case, we tested the association between trust in institutions, in civic and governmental institutions, and support for dictatorships. And here we were a bit surprised because the relationship is positive. So the more students trust in institutions, the more likely are they to support a dictatorship. So that was, at the beginning, we thought counterintuitive. We were, to be honest, expecting the opposite. But then we started to think, well, why could this be the case? Because it doesn't make sense in first view. No? So what we thought is probably students have lower levels of trust in institutions because they are better informed. So the idea was, if the students are better informed, if they know what they are talking about, if they know what institutions should be doing, they are more critical, and therefore they don't trust institutions. But this only holds if depending on the institutions, no? Depending what the performance of the institutions. So this is just the graphs for you to see economic benefits, support for dictatorships when they bring economic benefits associated with the trust in institutions. So this is the scale of trust in institutions. So we can see that in all countries, the more they trust, the more likely are they to support a dictatorship. So it's the same here, and it's the same for the other question. Similar pattern in all cases. Very clear differences in all countries. So to come back to this point, we said that we thought that if students know more, they are better informed, so they are likely to be more critical. If that is the case, it should be different in different countries. So we thought in countries with weaker democracies, students with higher levels of civic knowledge would have lower levels of trust in institutions. So there should be a negative association. So because the students are critical, they know more, they are more critical, and if their institutions are not working properly, they are not going to trust them. On the other hand, if the students know a lot, they are knowledgeable, but their democratic system is stronger and the institutions are working fine, they will trust them. The good thing about having a study like ICCS, in contrast, for example, with national studies, is that we have the possibility of make these kind of comparisons. We have if we take only the information from the Latin American countries, we know that all these Latin American countries have if you look in the literature, different studies, they have very weak democracies. They have high levels of corruption. They have lower levels of transparency, freedom of speech, etc. So the idea was because the democracies are weak, that's why students who know a lot are critical. In order to contrast this hypothesis, we took the 5 least corrupt countries according to the Corruption Perception Index, which are the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, just to compare to the 5 Latin American countries that we had. And effectively, we can see a very clear differences. In countries with stronger democracies, the association is positive. So the students who know more trust the institutions. In countries with weak democracies, the association is negative. Students who know more are more critical and they don't trust the institutions. So this is what we see here is the correlation coefficient. So it's very clear, significant in all countries, like a very clear pattern. So what are the implications of these results? So the first thing that we wanted to say, that we say in the brief, is schools can contribute to the promotion of democratic values by improving the quality of civic education. So if schools can improve the learning outcomes in terms of civic knowledge, if they can improve the quality of civic education, they can play a role then to improve, to address this issue. No, they can promote democratic values, and they could contribute for citizens, for children, not to be willing to vote in a dictatorial system. But we also wanted to emphasize that it's not only schools, it's also families. Families can also do a lot. If families have a space, have the dynamic to open a space for parents to talk to children, for families to discuss political and social issues, that also will help to promote democratic values. Now, for this one, we have to be very careful, because what happens if parents are up for a dictatorial system, then it could work the other way around. No? But what we sustain here is that what is important is to open the space for discussion, so people can be critical about what's going on in the country. And the third thing is that civic institutions, governmental institutions, also have a role to play. So these institutions within countries may be able to support the development of democratic values in young people by improving their transparency and eradicating corrupt practices. And this is particularly in the case of the Latin American countries, where these two things, corruption and transparency, are big problems in the region. No? So, of course, if the students who are more knowledgeable can be critical and they see that things are not working properly, that institutions are not working as they should be working, they're not doing what they should be doing, then they are not going to trust the civic institutions. And that's why it might be that they are open to try something different, something that is not an alternative to democracy in this case, because democracy is not working as it should. More implications. So change does not only depend on the education system. Policies must be designed and applied at different levels in a coordinated manner. So we don't think that just by adjusting the curriculum, the civic education curriculum in schools, we are going to solve this problem. We think that this is a complex problem. Reality, society is complex. So we have to address this problem from different fronts, at different levels, in a coordinated manner. It's not only about the education system, it's about all what happened in families, in society, with the civic institutions. It's a broader problem, and it has to be addressed in a coordinated manner, not in an isolated way. Moreover, there are consequences about there are a consensus about the multidimensionality of civic and citizenship education. So apart from looking at the different levels, families, schools, systems, we also think that it's important to conceptualize civic and citizenship education and participation as a multidimensional construct. And this is in line with, well, if you were in the opening talk, we were talking about this work that we have been doing on civic education, global citizenship education, and education for sustainable development, and how the UNESCO, and not only the UNESCO, but the countries that integrate UNESCO, have agreed on a framework that conceptualizes civic education as a multidimensional construct, and which is very similar to what the framework of ICCS says. It also evaluates civic education with this perspective, with this multidimensional perspective. So we need policies and practices that consider these two elements, the multi-level policies and the multidimensional conceptualization. So as I was saying, we have to look at families, but also we have to look at the schools, and we have to look at institutions, and we have to look at knowledge, but we also have to look at socio-emotional skills, and we also have to look at behaviors. And of course, these policies, depending on what you want to achieve, the role of different institutions is going to be different. No? If we want to look at knowledge, for example, the biggest role is going to be played by schools. We want to talk about socio-emotional skills. The biggest role is going to be played by families, and so on and so forth. No? So we have to that was our message, you know, at the end. We have to look at different levels, but we also have to look at the multidimensionality of this concept. And yeah, and that was my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andres. I think now we can have room for questions. I already collected one from the chat, and I will be addressing that. It's for Ellen or me. Let's see, or both. We may have complementary information. But please, in the meantime, let me know if you would like to have a question for us. So the first question was from Dora, and Dora was looking at the results that Ellen presented, and she saw that those results are from 2016. And she was asking, is there new data coming, and when would that be? So I think Ellen can answer that, and I can complement with some insights from Italy and from INVALSI.
Yeah, there is new data coming. I think in 2022 normally. But of course, the COVID may have slowed the process of data collection down for some months. I think Italy was, and INVALSI was one of the few countries that actually did a complete field trial of the questionnaires. So that's impressive in these times. So there will be new data of the same, of looking into tolerance towards immigrants and also the civic knowledge, yeah, from 2022, most likely. And normally that's available like a year and a half after that they went to schools with the questionnaire. So I think probably in 2023, the beginning of 2024, will be the release of the new data. But unfortunately, normally Flanders is not participating, so I will be looking with excitement to the Italian data then.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I just wanted to add, Dora, that ICCS, so the study that both briefs talked about, it's a study that takes place every 5 years, organized by the IEA. And normally, you know, it was conducted in 2016. The data will be published in 2018. So indeed, we are, you know, waiting every 5 years for a new cycle, knowing that the results will be more or less available to the public in 1 or 2 years' time after that date. But now we have Luisa that wants to have a question. Luisa, just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm here. Just my webcam maybe doesn't work, but it's fine. Oh, okay, it works. Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed the session. And I have some comments and questions, one for David and the other one for your work and Claes. Anyway, for David, I completely agree regarding the need to build a bridge between research and practice, especially in terms of giving very easy information for policymakers. Only in this way we can really help support the policymakers and the overall institutions to improve their work, including the educational institutions. For this reason, I was wondering in this kind of making a bridge between research and practice, where researchers, scholars can speak very easy, simplifying their way to make study, to make research, we can talk about responsible research. This is my question, because I'm a member of a network, a responsible research network. It's an international network where scholars and researchers from all the world try to work together to be responsible in their research. It means that they can choose their research topics considering the real need of the community, of the society. And I can find this way to think in David's presentation. This is my questions. Can we consider your orientation, your suggestions, your comments in this direction in terms of responsible research? This is my first question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wasn't really short, sorry about that.
No, and I think it's a very good point, and the idea of responsible research is a very interesting thing. Two things. First of all, I believe if you're doing applied research in this situation, then we do have some responsibility to help people interpret the research that we're doing, right? So in that sense, in a technical way, it's responsible research. I believe to write a brief. What's tricky is being able as a researcher to tell the story without oversimplifying it. And that is one of the things that I could tell you that I struggle with the most, even in my own editing of briefs, of getting that right. And I can imagine that's part of the issue, right? So that's why it's always the struggle, and it's always why the process of writing a brief becomes so difficult, is because what information do you need to include to be responsible? And what information can you exclude so people can read it, right? And so I think it's really a balancing act. You're almost like on the high wire, and you could fall down on either side very quickly. And not falling down is one of the challenges.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. Also because sometimes the reviewers and the editors say to scholars, to us when we write down papers, your study is interesting, but you follow much more the real community, the real stuff, the practitioner side, and where is the theoretical frameworks? Where are your justifications? It's hard to match. Thank you. And then, can I?
Yes, please go ahead, Luisa.
Yeah, just one. It's much more a curiosity, because I really like the study about civic knowledge and the tolerance towards immigrants. And maybe I missed some parts during the presentation, very interesting study. But did you consider also if the different levels of civic knowledge can depend on the educational background, but also the cultural models? For example, Italians are more like to be nice with Hispanic people. People from southern, for example, from southern of other countries. Also, for example, when there are some phenomena like the the coronavirus pandemic, some problems with the tolerance with immigrants occurred because of these events. It happened, for example, in Italy against Chinese students at school with Italians. And they never had problems before. But with the COVID, with the pandemic, coronavirus pandemic, there were some negative episodes with them. I had the same problems with the Chinese students at the university. For this reason, I think, I don't know. Did you consider cultural models and also the impact of shock events on the levels of tolerance? Thank you.
Yeah,
I know that the maybe didn't. I know
that's. I think that's a very good question, and maybe I'm going to take the first part first, because the shock events. This is of course something that you can, I think, take into account when you discuss the results you see in a specific country. Or the differences you see in a specific country. For example, we were in Belgium very lucky that we actually in 2016 went to the schools before the 22nd of March because we had the so we had the terrorist attack. So that might have been an event that we would have seen in the data. But actually, so these things, I think, can only be taken into account afterwards, but should be recorded in a logbook. And I'm not thinking about this study, but for example, we also in our research group look into political trust. And there in 2009, Flanders was really in a kind of institutional crisis. We had government after government after government, like we are famous for that now, Belgium, I guess. So, and that could be really seen in the ICCS data of 14-year-olds. So I think these things matter. And we should definitely, as researchers, list these things, and these can have an effect. For this study, we did not take this shock effect into account. I think 2016, there was luckily no COVID then, so I think that shock effect will not be seen in the data we discussed here. I know for a fact that Sweden was very concerned of the results, especially regarding tolerance, because they went in a very short time from a very homogeneous, homogeneous population to a more heterogeneous population. And they were actually surprised that that was not seen in the tolerance towards immigrants data. So far, so I can say that for Sweden. And then for your first question into the cultural models, I think the only thing that I can say that you can kind of link to that when you look at the variability, you see between the countries. And you can indeed, in your interpretation, you can link it to the cultural models. We decided not to. Why? Because we wanted maybe to leave the room to the policymakers to make that interpretation themselves. But we actually mentioned the variability as a very important outcome of our study into the link between civic knowledge and tolerance towards immigrants. So I hope there that then policymakers can use their own knowledge of the cultural models to make that analysis more refined and put it into practice. But Magda, maybe you can add to my answer, or do you completely agree?
Not more than that. First of all, my apologies. You don't see me because I'm experiencing some connection problems, so it's better to leave the camera off. Yes, we can definitely. We did not look into this specifically. We try to look at things like cultural comparability within different regions in Europe, and we actually I have an article with some colleagues that looked into that, and we discussed a little bit more the context. But as Ellen said, for this brief, we left that to the reader. Nonetheless, it's definitely something that is going to be addressed in a future research, and we will keep you informed. I will leave now Andres to take the next question. He knows all about it from Ettore.
Thank you, Magda. Yes, and thank you, Ettore, for the question. I think this is a very interesting question. What Ettore was saying is that he wonders if improving of discussion habits about social and political issues with parents having a lower level of democratic sensibility can have a positive effect in developing a critical approach in young people, or on the contrary, it can have a plagiarizing, a negative effect on the development of democratic values in young people. And I totally agree. We did mention something in the brief, because of course, if parents themselves have anti-democratic beliefs or values, and they establish discussions with and they discuss often with their children, the most likely thing to happen is that they're going to be influenced by their parents. But then again, we cannot see that from the data. Unfortunately, this data set, as I always say, these international large-scale assessments are very good to establish patterns, to identify patterns, but they're not very good to tell us why, to actually unveil the actual social mechanisms that are going on. We can have an idea, but for that, we have to do other kind of studies. Right now, actually, we already collected some information only in Mexico to follow up on this project. So we wanted to know the reasons why. So we have some patterns in the brief. We know that schools have a role, families have a role, systems have a role to play, but we don't know exactly how or why. So we did this a number of focus groups with people who were 14 years old at the time of the ICCS. And we were asking them, why do you say that? And of course, what I can tell you, even though we don't focus on this topic particularly, we get some information from the students. And what we can know supports very much what we were thinking before. No? This has to be a coordinated effort. Yes, parents may or may not have democratic beliefs, but if students have knowledge to bring into the discussion, that definitely helps. And the more often they discuss, the more open these discussions are, the more they feel confident enough to bring up their opinions. There's a scale in ICCS that is open classroom for discussion. I always thought that there should be a scale that is open family for discussion. And this scale, what it measures is to what extent people feel comfortable expressing their opinions, even when they don't agree with most of the people. This kind of information, I think this is the discussion itself is important. And the other thing, well, yes, we have to be very clear about the limitations of this kind of data and also the potential of this kind of data. But we cannot use it we should not try to use it to answer every possible question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from any of you? In the meantime, I wanted to ask something to Patricia. How interested are you in policy briefs? Do you see policy briefs as something useful? to be done by INVALSI, and for who? Thank you.
But we are always interesting. We are scared about all the job that we have to do, introducing others topics. Just this, because we are now more interested to the put on the same scale international assessment with national assessment. And this morning with Daniel, we investigate this about study more European countries. Sorry, because it's late. European
okay, Patty, no problem.
To study an assessment that is that make that we can compare the results of our countries. So we are interested, but maybe we have to decide the priority.
Okay, yes, I was today in that discussion with Daniel Maus. Indeed, it was about harmonizing data.
Yeah.
So in this perspective, you're interested in comparisons.
Yes.
So you can compare the results of Italy with other countries. And in that case, I think because in the UK, and maybe Andres can correct me if I'm wrong, there is also a census-based national assessment that is quite similar with what's going on in Italy. That's not such a far-fetched idea. So, but I guess what you're telling us is that some briefs that will be on issues that are very specific of the Italian educational system, like the ones we talked today about regional differences, like or inequalities between different ethnic groups and so on, that would also be somewhat harmonized and compared with other systems would be something that you consider informative.
We have a lot of, there are a lot of important things that we have to face, but it's not often is not INVALSI that decide the policy. So I can speak for just for the statistical department.
Indeed, I understand. No, I saw recently an initiative that it's done by the Spanish a twin of INVALSI, which is INE, and I think they have been involved in translating in Spanish all the briefs that are done by the OECD and the IEA. So that's a neutral way to bring in, you know, findings. So that could be one of the alternatives. I also wanted to ask something. Francesco, are you still with us? Francesco Affisati? I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I thought maybe he has something to add from his own experience, but I don't think he can hear us at the moment. Well, please let me know if you have any other questions. Otherwise, we can conclude this session, and I thank very much to all the speakers of today and to Patrizia and INVALSI for hosting us. And we promise hands-on exercises when in Italy, hopefully.
Yeah, in November, at the end of November in Rome, and we almost choose the hotel. Very nice with the roof. You can see. Very, very, very nice place, hopefully, without COVID.
Well, we're looking forward to it. Well, thank you all so much. If there are no other questions, have a nice afternoon and a nice continuation of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
See you. Bye bye.
Bye.